Hello everybody, this is Connor at BoatsDon'tSink, here with another Shadowverse Evolve deck profile. Today we're going to be looking at yet another BP03 deck, this time Armed Dragon. First off, what is Armed? Armed is an archetype from the Shadowverse anime that was introduced with one card in BP02 Reign of Bahamut, Draconic Armor. This card allows you to summon a Draconic Weapon token, and if Overflow is active you summon 2 instead. Draconic Weapon is an amulet token that costs 1 and has nothing but an activated ability to engage itself and put it into the cemetery to select a Dragoncraft follower on your field to give it +1 defense and the armed trait. So effectively you're creating these weapons and equipping them to your Dragoncraft followers in order to arm them with the weapon and give them extra defense. In set 2, this basically did nothing. There were no interactions with it other than giving the extra defense. But now in BP03, Flame of Lævateinn, we have a handful of new armed cards, a lot of which care about either you having Draconic weapons or having armed trait cards, either spells or followers, or benefiting from being targeted by effects, including the Draconic weapon effect. So today we're going to be looking at a deck that uses some of these cards to create an aggressive strategy, pretty unlike what Dragon has been using up until this point. As usual, before we take a look at the deck list itself, reminder that this is just meant to be a starting point to work off of and may not be fully optimized for any specific meta. You should test this for yourself and make any changes that you find necessary to fit either your playstyle or local meta. Taking a look at the deck here, first thing that's going to pop out is A, yes, I baited you with the Lævateinn Dragon in the thumbnail. There's no Lævateinn Dragon in here. That card costs way too many play points for this deck. Second, there's also no Dragon Oracle, because all of our cards are super cheap. We don't need to ramp. We just want to go fast and play cards aggressively. This is going to be a lot more similar to the Aggro Abyss decks from set 2 meta, rather than the ramp Dragon decks that you're used to. So we just have a lot of low-cost cards, a lot of aggressively statted cards, and Forte to round it out, because what's a Dragon deck without Forte? Our Evolve deck is also pretty simple, just the cards we play that evolve and some carrots for our Uma Musume followers. And as always, you can check out the actual deck log page for this deck using the code in the bottom right. That's going to be Q7EX for this deck. So we have 29 followers here, 11 spells, which 11 spells is actually going to seem pretty high for an aggro deck, but they have pretty good interactions with a lot of our cards. Our curve, 17 2-drops, 11 3-drops, and 9 1-drops, with our curve topping out at 3 4-drops. This is probably an even lower curve than the aggro Abyss decks typically played, so we are really just trying to jam everything and go fast. We don't have as much Storm in the form of Ghosts as those decks had, but we have other ways to make up for it with a lot of effect burn. So first card we're playing is 3 copies of Goblin. This is a just 1-cost 2/2 neutral. Unfortunately, since it is neutral, it means that we're not going to be able to select it with Draconic Weapon in order to buff it and give it the armed trait. Unfortunately, Dragoncraft does not get its own 1-cost 2/2 until CP02 and BP07, and those are still the only 2 that even Japan has to this point, as opposed to, you know, Swordcraft, which 3 sets in has like 2 or 3 of its own, just 1-cost 2/2 vanillas, or not even vanillas, they have extra text on them. But we're stuck with Goblin here for now, so we're gonna make it work. Goblin does also have an evolved form, but we're not playing it just because paying 4 to get +2/+2 is not worth it. We have way better things we can be doing with those play points. Next card, we have 3 copies of Armor Burst. This is a 1 play point spell. Select an armed follower on your field and an enemy follower on the field. Put the first follower, which is your armed follower, into its owner's EX area. Deal 3 damage to the enemy follower you selected. And summon a Draconic Weapon token. So the armed followers that we have in the deck, there's 3 different armed followers, so 9 cards total that we can put back into our EX area in order to deal 3 damage to an enemy follower and summon a Draconic Weapon token. That's pretty good value, 1 play point to deal 3 to something, and we're getting a weapon back out of it. We do lose a follower on our board, but there are ways that we can take advantage of this. We can also target followers that aren't just these 3, since using a Draconic weapon will give the armed trait to any of our Dragoncraft followers. We can actually target pretty much anything we want with Armor Burst, and the weapon that we used to give that follower armed trait is going to be refunded by Armor Burst itself. This allows us to do cool things like looping the Fanfare effect on Fire Lizard, or reusing a Dark Dragoon Forte by putting it into the EX area after we hit our opponent for 5, and then hold it up to play again on a later turn. The other 1-drop spell we play is Flowers for You. This is from the Uma Musume collaboration set. Effect is to select an Uma Musume follower on your field, give it +1 attack, and draw a card. If the selected follower is a Seiyun Sky, give it +1/+1 more. So, giving +1 attack and drawing a card is pretty good already. Aggro decks love cantripping because it means we don't run out of gas. We are kind of limited on the number of Uma Musume followers we have. There are 8 in this deck, being 2, 3, and 3 copies of these cards respectively. We could play some more. I'll talk about some options for that later. And unfortunately, unlike the armed trait, we don't have a way to give things the Uma Musume trait. So we are limited in only being able to target these 3, which means Flowers for You can unfortunately sometimes be a brick if we draw it with no targets. But hopefully that doesn't happen. And if it does, well, try again next time, I guess. The payoffs for this card are worth it being a brick sometimes, in my opinion. And we'll take a better look at those once we talk about Seiyun Sky, since she's getting an extra buff from this. Moving into 2-cost followers, we play 2 copies of Bamboo Memory. This is a 2-cost 2/3, which unfortunately is not as aggressive of a stat line as we'd like. But, Fanfare, we can discard a card to deal 2 damage to each enemy leader. So 2 damage face just for discarding a card. With our curve being as low as it is, it may not always be like the best option to discard a card because you might be able to run out your hand. But if you draw multiple 3-drops and it looks like you're not going to be able to run them all out by the time you need to, discarding extra cards to just put 2 into your opponent's face is great. And if you do have just way too many cards for some reason, you can use Armor Burst to like buy this back and play it again, which is pretty decent. Gives us just a lot of extra reach, sort of, especially in the later turns where we might only need a little bit of extra damage while our opponent has a ward up. This can deal damage straight to their face. Next, we'll play 3 copies of Dragon Summoner. This is from BP03. Again, not super aggressively statted, it's just a 1/3, but the effect on it is worthwhile, and it's still going to be able to chip in for some damage. While some of our other followers might hit harder, this one is likely to live a little longer, just because it dodges more removal spells, so that is a benefit that it has going for it. We can pay 1 to evolve into a 2/4. On evolve, look at the top 3 cards of your deck. You may reveal a Dragoncraft follower from among them and add it to your hand. Put the remaining cards on the bottom of your deck in any order. If we don't have any other evolves to use, just jamming this to check top 3 and add a follower is pretty good. It keeps our hand full of just more gas to keep throwing at our opponent. It can find some of our specific sort of combo pieces for the armed interactions or Uma Musume interactions, or it can just find a Forte that we can throw at our opponent. Next 2-drop we have is from set 1. This is a 3/2 Fire Lizard. Fanfare, select an enemy leader or enemy follower on the field and deal it 1 damage. So this guy effectively represents 4 damage for 2 play points, which is really good rate. That's assuming he doesn't get removed. Our opponent does pretty much have to put removal into this guy though, since 3 damage to face is pretty scary. And on top of being able to go face with the 1 damage effect, we do have the benefit as well of if we go first and our opponent plays a, say we pass or we play a Goblin turn 1, and our opponent plays a 2/1 or a 1/1, our Fire Lizard can come down turn 2 and just pop their turn 1 play. While it doesn't go damage to face, it does effectively buy us kind of an extra turn that they didn't get to play anything, which can be really good in the long term. Sometimes better than just 1 damage to face. Next, we have a 2-cost 2/2 Hammer Dragonute. This is one of the new armed followers. Fanfare, look at the top 4 cards of your deck. You may reveal an armed spell from among them and add it to your hand. Put the remaining cards on the bottom of your deck in any order. So we are playing 2 different armed spells that we can grab off of this, 3 copies of each. There is a third, which is Draconic Armor that I talked about. We are not playing this card just because it's a little slow, We don't care enough about the Draconic Weapon tokens that we want to be spending a play point just to make one. We'd rather get them incidentally with some of our other effects. But we do have the first two, Armor Burst and Draconic Smash, which both are removal spells and both give us more Draconic Weapons. So they're just kind of going to keep our chain going as long as we're playing. So it makes Hammer Dragon Newt pretty good just to jam and sort of cantrip back off of. We can also pay one to evolve into a 3/3. On evolve, we deal 2 damage to each enemy leader. So again, this is just a little bit of extra reach. It means that Hammer Dragon Newt often, on play, represents 2 damage immediately, which is like kind of pseudo Storm, since he's a 2 attack follower on the front side. And then he's also going to be a 3/3 on the back that can threaten even more damage. If you have Draconic Weapons, you can start buffing this outside of cheap removal spell range. Getting him to 3/4 makes him pretty difficult to remove with a lot of early removal. So that can be pretty relevant as well. The other thing about this guy, actually, we do play 3, you'll notice, over like a second Forte or anything. That is because this is one of our better targets to keep armor bursting, since he adds a spell to hand. We can armor burst him into our EX area, play him again, and then evolve him again to keep dealing 2 damage to our opponent. And that's going to be a pretty good way to just sort of chip away at them. Especially, you know, you hit them for 3 by attacking with him, and then armor burst, play him again, evolve him again, to them again. And off the fanfare, you get to dig for your next armor burst to keep going if they just don't answer him. So it forces removal. The last 2-cost follower we have is our next Uma Musume follower. It's going to be Tamamo Cross. This is a 2-cost 2/1, so a little low on the stats, but it's fine. By racing, so we can serve her 1 carrot. Give this follower +1/+1, making her a 3/2, good aggressive stat line. Select up to 1 enemy follower on the field and deal it 2 damage. So this is again just a little bit of extra removal tied to our followers that have good stat lines on their own. Looking at our 2-cost spell, we have Draconic Smash. This is a 2-cost quick timing. Select an enemy follower on the field, deal it 3 damage, and summon a Draconic Weapon token. 2-cost 3 damage quick is pretty decent rate already. It is a little worse than an Overflow Blazing Breath, but it's good at removing a lot of early game cards. This can be a decent turn 2 play just on its own if we don't have a follower to run out. Otherwise, turn 4, turn 5, you're using this to clear small wards that your opponent might be putting down. Things like Snow White, Bellringer Angel, Unevolved Ancient Elf is a 3/3 that you can clear out. This is pretty relevant in that matchup, I guess, if you go second, or even if you go first, really, and they just play like turn 1 Harvest Festival, turn 2 Ancient Elf, make a 3/3, and then pass. This is a good way to answer that on rate. And makes a Draconic Weapon that's going to help us out by, you know, buffing our defense, giving our followers more stats, things like that. The Draconic Weapons are just good in general. Obviously, Armor Burst we've talked about a few times. Buffing stats, good. Making our defense higher makes our followers harder to kill, which means we get more attacks in with them. But we do also have an additional follower here, Lance Lizard, that we're especially going to want the Draconic Weapons for, since that's going to deal extra damage to our opponent even more once we start popping Draconic Weapons, and we'll look at him here in a second as well. Moving to 3-cost followers, we have Draconeer Knuckle Dragon. This is kind of the mascot guy for the deck. He's a 3-cost 3/3 fanfare. We summon a Draconic Weapon. Not going to say any more about those. We know what these do. We can pay 1 to evolve him into a 4/4. On evolve, select an enemy follower on the field, deal it 2 damage. If there's another armed follower on our field, we deal 4 instead. This is pretty reminiscent of Dragon Warrior, which is basically a staple card that Dragon's been running since the beginning. Dragon Warrior is a 4/4 that deals 3 on evolve. We're dealing 2, but sometimes 4. Obviously, we have the 9 copies of armed followers in our deck to begin with, but since the base form makes a Draconic Weapon on fanfare, as long as we have any other Dragoncraft follower, it doesn't even have to be one of our armed ones, we can give that the armed trait before evolving, meaning we're basically always going to be able to deal 4 with Draconeer, which makes him better than Dragon Warrior even without the synergies with the rest of the deck for us. Our next 3-cost follower is our last armed follower in the deck. This is Lance Lizard. This is a 3-cost 3/4. Good defensive stat line. and 3 damage to the face when he attacks is still pretty good. Fanfare, if Overflow is active, summon a Draconic Weapon. Hopefully this doesn't come up too much. You don't really want the game going that long, but if it does, then, you know, extra source of Draconic Weapons, which is going to fuel his own second effect. Once during each of your own turns, when this follower is selected for an ability, give it +1 attack and deal 1 damage to each enemy leader. So this effect is super cool. Obviously, Draconic Weapons, they select Lance Lizard, give him +1 defense, and then his own effect gives him +1 attack, deals 1 to the enemy leader. So this would be a 3-cost 4/5 that burns 1 immediately, which is just insane rate. And we get Draconic Weapons just kind of incidentally off so many effects that it makes him super powerful. We can also use Armor Burst with Lance Lizard. While it does mean that we're not going to be able to benefit off of the 1 attack since he's going to EX area, it does still trigger the 1 damage. And once Lance Lizard goes to EX area, if we play him back to the field in the same turn, it'll have reset the once per turn. He'll be considered a new card, meaning we can use the Draconic Weapon that Armor Burst makes to trigger his effect again, make him a 4/5 again, deal 1 damage again. So you can use this to just sort of chip away at your opponent as you're attacking with all your followers. And other awkward thing, if you don't have any ways to target him on your own, attacking with Lance Lizard, if your opponent uses a quick spell to target him and like try to deal damage to him or destroy him, that will also trigger his effect, which is going to burn them 1, even if they destroy him. And if it's not enough to take him out, he gets the extra attack and just chunks them for more damage. So they have to be kind of careful with removing him with things like that. Especially effects like Agnes Tachyon that might not be enough to, like, you know, -1/-1's not going to kill him on its own. So they have to be kind of careful spreading around targeted stuff like that. Next we have Saiyan Sky. This is a 3-cost 1/3. Seems like a pretty bad stat line for an aggro deck, but this card is just insanely gas. I talked about this card for a while in my Uma Musume deck profile. I played the card there, and it's wonderful. So this is a 3-cost 1/3 with Storm and Intimidate, and Strike. Give this follower +1 attack. So has Storm, can attack immediately. With the Strike effect, it means it's going to be attacking for at least 2 damage. And Intimidate makes it unable to be attacked. So it's going to be hard for the opponent to remove. They can't just play followers, evolve, attack into it. They're going to have to use effects. This gets even harder for them once we look at Flowers for You. This is the 1-cost spell that draws us a card and gives +1 attack. But if we select Saiyan Sky, it gives an additional +1/+1. So that's +2/+1 total, making this a 3/4. If we just turn 4, go Saiyan Sky Flowers, we get a 3/4 that, in addition, Strike gets an attack. So we're going to be attacking with a 4/4 on turn 4, straight to the face. That's already pretty good stat line. When you also consider that the opponent has to use an effect to remove it and can't just attack into it, a lot of early effect removal is going to be 3 damage or less. 4 is pretty hard to get to unless you're using something like Serpent Wrath or just like Execution or Acolyte's Light. Otherwise, getting all the way up to 4 and 5 damage is pretty rough at that point in the game. But this gets even better. We could do all that in the Uma Musume deck. Once we look at Draconic Weapons, this gets even crazier. Because any Draconic Weapons that we have sitting around that we're not using, we can just put into Saiyan Sky to make her even harder to kill. 1 Draconic Weapon is going to put her at 4/5 on turn 4. If you have 2, you can get her to 4/6, which is basically out of range of anything that's not Execution. Even Serpent Wrath isn't killing her at that point, meaning next turn you're going to get in for even more damage, and that can just snowball super fast. This card forces all of your opponent's spell answers basically immediately, which forcing spell answers does mean that your other followers that don't get to attack the turn they come in are more likely to survive, since they're not going to have spells to use on them as often, hopefully. Next, we have 2 copies of Demonic Strike. This is just 3 damage, deal 3 to an enemy leader or enemy follower. You can use this as follower removal if you absolutely have to, but otherwise this 3 is pretty much always going face. We're playing this over extra followers just because the 3 straight to face is better than attacking a lot of times. even though we can get extra utility off other followers. I really worry about this deck dealing with like high defense ward followers, especially once our opponent hits turn 5, turn 6, turn 7. If they're able to play big wards, we might not be able to get as much attack damage through, but Demonic Strike is still going to put 3 to the face and still let us keep chipping in the last points of damage that we need. And lastly, we have 3 copies of Forte. This is just a staple across all the Dragon decks. 4-cost 5/1 with Storm. You can play this on turn 4, hit 5 face immediately. It evolves for 2, but we only play 1 evolve, so you might not be doing that all the time. This actually has some cool interactions that we can do without evolving it, which is not normally what you're going to see in Dragon decks. By using Draconic Weapons, we can give this the armed trait, obviously, which means we can use Armor Burst on it. So a turn 5 play might be to play Forte, attack for 5 with it, and then after you've attacked, you use the Draconic Weapon to give it armed, use Armor Burst to put it back into your EX area, deal 3 to an enemy follower, and make a new Draconic Weapon. And now you have a Forte sitting in your EX area ready to go on the next turn to deal 5 or 7 more damage. If you go first and do this on 5, it means you'll have 6 play points on the following turn to both play and evolve Forte, which represents 7 damage with the evolve, meaning you can get 12 in across turns 5 and 6, which should probably just be enough to clean up any game without you having to draw a second copy of Forte, which is something to keep in mind, something pretty cool you can do. You don't have to. Sometimes just running out Forte on turn 4 and hitting for 5 damage and using your other followers later can be good enough. If you play a Forte while you have any other followers on board, your other followers are basically always going to survive because Forte is going to eat whatever your opponent has, like, removal-wise. So, yeah, Forte is just a great card overall, great finisher for the deck. We only play 1 copy of the Evolve, partly just because we don't want the game to go that long. It costs 6 play points to evolve her, and by then we want the game to be wrapping up, turn 6 or 7 at the latest. Ideally earlier if our opponent just doesn't have good enough removal, but some matchups it's going to go a little longer. But yeah, so deck as a whole, I think it's pretty cool. Very different from most of the Dragon decks. Pros, we have lots of removal effects tied to our aggressive bodies. We get, let's see, like Fire Lizard deals 1, which isn't huge removal, but Tamamo Cross deals 2, Draconeer deals 4. So we get some like extra removal just sort of tied to our dudes. We also have 2 removal spells, which kind of just makes this whole deck kind of tempo-y, right? We're going to be stopping our opponent from beating us while we're beating our opponent down. It's a fast enough deck to get under most decks' removal. Especially right now, removal is kind of light in the format, it feels like. Especially when you're looking at like Forest and Haven being kind of 2 of the big decks, and Sword. Sword has to evolve most of their followers or be able to attack to get there. Haven is pretty much relying on Humpty Dumpty for a lot of its removal. They're not really playing much more than like maybe 2 or 3 copies of a low-cost removal spell for aggro decks. So you can get in and sort of punish a lot of those decks since they've cut their lower-cost removal for higher-cost things that hit big followers. Other pro here is we have uninteractive burn effects to help close out games. Bamboo Memory, obviously 2 to face, Fire Lizard 1 to face, Hammer Dragonute 2 to face. What else do we have? We have Lance Lizard 1 to face, Demonic Strike 3 to face. So lots of just burn effects. And in addition, Dark Dragoon Forte's Evolve has Aura, so it can't be selected by your opponent's removal spells, making it another consistent way to close out games without having to worry about interaction. Cons of the deck, however, it does struggle to remove high defense ward followers. We have lots of like 2 and 3 and some 4 damage removal, but once it gets higher than that, we basically have to start throwing followers at our opponent, and we really don't want to be throwing our followers into wards. We would much rather than be going face and be winning by the time we have to deal with wards, so not great there. Other downside is that if the game progresses too long, you are going to run out of steam. It's kind of an issue with all these low-cost aggro decks. Once you hit, you know, 3 play points, 4 play points, 5 play points, you're playing multiple cards in a turn and not drawing as many to make up for them. Even though we have Flowers, cantrips, Dragon Summoner, cantrips, Hammer Dragonute, sometimes cantrips, you're still going to be throwing a lot of spells at your opponent, a lot of followers at your opponent, and you are going to run out probably before your opponent does. Some other cards I would consider for the deck in a couple slots. First up, we have Yaina Muteki. This is a 3-cost 3/3 Umamusume follower. With On Race, give this follower +1/+1. Select up to one other follower on your field and give it +1/+1. So for 4 play points, we get a 4/4 that buffs another follower. Most obvious thing, we can buff Lance Lizard, which triggers its effect, making it a +2/+1 effectively, putting Lance Lizard to 5/5. So if we can play Lance Lizard on 3, maybe use a Draconic Weapon to trigger his effect, put him to 4/5, deal 1 to the opponent. If they can't answer a 4/5, our next turn play, turn 4, would be Yaina Muteki. Race her, give him another +1/+1, make him a, what is that, 4/5 would go up to a 6/6, and trigger his effect again to deal 1 to the opponent, and then we can attack with a 6/6, meaning in 2 turns, Lance Lizard on his own has gotten us 8 damage, which is pretty great. It can also pump Seiyun Sky, which is just kind of our snowball-y follower that's hard to deal with. Being able to pump defense into Seiyun Sky is super relevant, since it does mean that she's going to get harder to remove by effect as well. In addition, not the main reason we'd play this, but Flowers for You can only target Umamusume followers. This would give us an extra count of Umamusume followers to target with that, in case we draw it and don't want it breaking our hand. The other follower I'd maybe consider is Trinity Dragon. This is a 2-cost 3/2, which is aggressive stat line, pretty good for aggro decks. It just has Intimidate. No other text. Similar to Seiyun Sky, this makes it a little hard to remove. Your opponent has to use effects or spells. They can't just attack it. And we can use Draconic Weapons to buff that defense to kind of keep getting it out of a spell range to kill it. Unfortunately, starting at 2 defense means that it is kind of weak to removal right as it gets played before we can start buffing it. Pretty much any removal spell is going to deal the 2 to kill it, and even after 1 Draconic Weapon, a lot of effects deal 3. So it's not super great, and that's why I don't have it on the list right now. Seiyun Sky being able to reach 4 defense the turn you play her is just kind of really what pushes her over the top in terms of being a good Intimidate follower. Looking at the list as a whole one more time, here we are. Just got those lots of 3-ofs. We like consistency in this format. And the Evolve deck with our 2 carrots and 8 followers. Again, you can check out the code at the bottom right, Q7EX, to see the deck log page. Thank you for watching. I know this is a little unorthodox of a dragon deck, not playing the ramp stuff you normally see, instead going for an aggro approach. But I think aggro is really good in the current format, so I'd like y'all to give it a try. Let me know what you think of the deck. If there's any decks you want to see me cover in the future, let me know. You can leave a comment down below. Don't forget to also like and subscribe. I'll see you when I post the next video. Should be Abyss. Until then, there should be some videos on the screen that you can watch. I'll see you then.